So we're going to go through the toolkit functions and talk about each of one and their domain and range. So it'll be a good review. So the constant function is f of x equals some constant number. It's a horizontal line at C. The domain is all real numbers, negative infinity to infinity. And the range, well, there's just one output. It's C. So that's a finite set. You'd write it in a set notation and just whatever that value is. Okay. The identity function, that's a line that kind of goes through the middle like that, has a slope of 1 and a y-intercept of 0, but it's the function f of x equals x. The domain is all real numbers. And the range is also all real numbers. Okay. The absolute value function. That's when we have f of x equals the absolute value of x. And remember, these are just the basics. They can be graphed differently, by adding stuff and subtracting stuff. But these are just the basic toolkit functions. So it goes in that V shape. And the domain is all real numbers. The range, though, the range goes from bottom to top, 0 to infinity. So that would be the range. The quadratic function. So f of x equals x squared. So that makes a shape a U-type shape. Try to draw a little graph here. Somewhat like that. The domain is actually all real numbers, negative infinity to infinity. But the range is going from 0, including the 0, to infinity. The cubic function. Cubic function looks like this. So it's as an equation, f of x equals x cubed. So the domain goes from negative infinity to infinity. Now that may seem odd because it's such a skinny function, but you could, have a domain element way out here at 100 and cube it. You'd get a really large number, but it's possible to do that. The range is also all real numbers from negative infinity to infinity because it's going in both directions. Okay. The reciprocal function. Now remember, the reciprocal function has asymptotes on both the x-axis and the y-axis. They should have little arrows on them. And then the graph is going up very quickly toward the asymptotes on that side. And oh shoot, I missed the point. And kind of runs asymptotic to those asymptotes. Okay, the function looks like f of x equals 1 over x. And so the domain, well, let's think about the domain here. So what x values can I have? I can have all the x values except 0. So it's going to be from negative infinity to 0. Don't include the 0. Union, and then 0 to infinity. What about the range? Well, if you look at the range, it's going to be the same thing. We can have any output, except we can't have 0. So the range is actually going to be the same thing, from negative infinity to 0. Union, 0 to infinity. All right. The reciprocal squared function. This one also has asymptotes at the x and y axes. And then the graph goes up very sharply toward the asymptotes, and then a mirror image on the other side, so something like that. The function is f of x equals 1 over x squared. So again, in the domain, we can have all real numbers except 0. So we're going to go from negative infinity to 0, union 0 to infinity. That would be the domain. But the range this time, you'll notice that you're always getting a positive output here. So we're going to have just from 0 to infinity. Those would be the range values. All right. The square root function. So remember that one has a starting point. It goes off like that. And so the function is f of x equals the square root of x. And the domain is going to be, so here's where we have to be careful with taking the square root of a negative number, but we can have it be 0. So it's going to be from 0 to infinity. And then what's the range here? Well, if you look at that, it looks like you're going to go from 0 to infinity as well. So that curve is going off to the right, but it's still going up a little bit. So it's going off toward infinity. And then our last one here, the cube root function, which, try to draw this graph real quick. Kind of that sideways snake thing going on. And again, these endpoints, they're not leveling off, even though it looks like that. They're still continuing up to the right and down over here, down to the left. So the function f of x equals the cubed root of x. The domain, all real numbers, that probably looks okay to you. But the range is also all real numbers. Okay, and all of this information is in the textbook as well.